This week, Mike Barr, creator of Batman and the Outsiders, Camelot 3000, Katana, and more, gives a keynote address at the Bowling Green State University Batman in Popular Culture Conference last April. He explains how he got into comics and the ups and downs of his work on Batman stories, and he answers audience questions. This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo. As I mentioned in our previous episode on The Killing Joke, I attended the Batman in Popular Culture Conference at Bowling Green State University in Ohio on April 12th and 13th. There were several keynote speakers, one of whom was longtime comics writer Mike Barr, who talked about his time at DC, especially as it pertained to writing Batman. It wasn't always a smooth ride working at DC, especially when the company reacted to his speaking up for the rights of Batman co-creator Bill Finger. In this episode, we present the keynote and the Q&A period in its entirety, from April 13th, 2019. First, you'll hear the voice of Dr. Charles Coletta, a lecturer at BGSU in their Department of Popular Culture and a co-organizer of the Batman Conference.
I'm especially happy that Mike W. Barr is here. The very first comic book that I started collecting from issue 1 was Batman and the Outsiders, and Camelot 3000. That's right, the era when I was starting to read comics in the early 80s. And his credits are too numerous.
He must be old, right?
I would be old. His credits are too numerous to mention, but I'm just going to read a little bit here. Mike W. Barr's first professional fiction was written for Ellery Queen's magazine. He has written for some of pop culture's most enduring icons, including Sherlock Holmes, Ellery Queen, Doc Savage, The Shadow, Captain America, The Hulk, Batman, of course, Star Trek, Star Wars, and The Simpsons. He's also created some iconic characters of his own, including the comic book series Camelot 3000, Batman and the Outsiders. He's written the Mage Agency, which was nominated for both the Eisner and Harvey Awards. And in 1987, he wrote the first Batman graphic novel, Son of the Demon, which introduced the character of Damian Wayne. With artist Jim Aparo, he created the female samurai Katana, who is all over the media now, and who has appeared in Batman, Beware the Batman, Arrow, and was featured in 2016's film Suicide Squad. Was also seen in the DC Superhero Girls franchise and in the cartoon Young Justice. So Katana is everywhere. Let's see. He also created the hero Geoforce, which is always one of my personal favorites. He has written for the online sites Icebox and Stanley Media, and Live to Tell the Tale, and co-created the webcomic Sorcerer of Fortune. In 2003, Pocket Books published his Star Trek novel Gemini, and I could keep going reading on and on. You don't want to hear me read his credit. You want to hear it from the man himself. So let's give a great big welcome to this.
Oh, thank you for having me, Chuck. So this is actually my second visit to your lovely campus here. The first was back in the 1970s when an ex-girlfriend of mine who was attending Bowling Green invited me up for the weekend to hear Leonard Nimoy speak. And I agreed to that not only because I wanted to hear Leonard Nimoy speak, but also, frankly, because I was hoping possibly for a rekindling of the romance that we had. To make a long story short, Leonard Nimoy was great. The rekindling of the romance was, shall we say, illogical. But we were talking about Batman. Somewhere when I was a kid, my mother we used to go grocery shopping on Friday night, and on the way home from there, we would stop at a local drugstore, and my mother would give me a dime in those days, and I would wander in and I would pick out whatever looked good to me. In those days, that was invariably either one of Julia Schwartz's superhero or science fiction titles, or a Batman title. Because Batman and I go way back. I have the a distinct privilege, although it's more coincidental than anything, of not remembering how long I've been a Batman fan. So actually, as long as I can remember, Batman's been a part of my life, which I think is pretty cool. Some of the stories in those days were pretty good and remain favorites to this day. But even the increasingly frequent science fiction stories worked, usually because they revolved around Batman. In those days, Batman's personality, no matter who was writing him, was consistent. He was resolute, maybe a little stiff, though he was capable of cracking a joke now and then, and above all, resourceful. He could, and often did, walk into a room surrounded by 12 gunmen and emerge victorious. He could be passionate, but he never allowed his passions to rule. He was righteous, but he was never self-righteous. He was an avenger, but he was never vengeful. Bruce Wayne could have turned inward in his despair. He could have turned to drugs or dubious religious movements to try to heal his soul. Instead, he sought a path that would heal himself, as well as heal a young boy whose life had been nearly destroyed. But the young boy needed an example, so Batman became a father, a big brother, or an uncle to save Robin from the life of isolation that Batman suffered. And he knew everything. In my favorite exchange from the TV show, Robin asks him, "Batman, is there anything you don't know?" And Robin replies, "Yes, Robin, several things, in fact." But you know he was kidding, because he knew everything because he was Batman. And his world was so cool. It was exactly the type of world to appeal to a young boy, and nowadays I assume young kids of all stripes. He lived in a cave, albeit the most technically advanced cave on the planet. It was so huge you couldn't see its ceiling, with a statue of a dinosaur and a giant penny. I mean, a giant penny, how cool is that? As a kid, you just love to have one of those in your living room. There's not a red-blooded boy who wouldn't be charmed by that. It never occurred to me to wonder until years later how Batman got the giant penny inside the Batcave. And I figured it was because he's Batman. And he wanted it there. And Batman gets what he wants. The Batcave became the place I most wanted to visit, to be occasionally edged out briefly by either 221B Baker Street or the bridge of the USS Enterprise. He drives a car that's like 2 blocks long, with a giant bat face on the front. And inside this car is an arsenal, a crime lab, spare costumes, and for all I knew as a kid, a swimming pool. And why not? Because he's Batman, and that's why he wants it. Everything in Batman's world is giant, but nothing is bigger than the man himself. In his essay, The Simple Art of Murder, Raymond Chandler writes of the detective character, "If there were enough like him, I think the world would be a very safe place to live in, and yet not too dull to be worth living in." Chandler had no idea he was writing about Batman, but he was. As I grew up, I realized that many people, many of whom were not Bob Kane, wrote and drew these stories. I couldn't draw, but I could think of things for Batman to do. But my desire to become a writer didn't really crystallize until I began devouring the exploits of Ellery Queen, which led years later to the creation of a comic book called The Maze Agency. It took me years to realize that it wasn't that big a jump from Batman to Ellery Queen, although as a kid I thought it was a quantum leap. I began writing letters of comment to comic books, and I published quite a few. None of these are particularly rich in insight, but they served to let the editors, usually Julie Schwartz, know that I was serious about the books and the characters and possibly someday contributing to them. As I grew up, I attended the New York Con. I went to the DC offices and met them, and I also met in New York Will Eisner, which was a great privilege. Will was a dear friend, and I miss him very much to this day. After 5 years of trying, I finally sold a story to Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine. It may be the proudest moment of my life. It took place at a comic book convention. As they say, write what you know. I submitted one elongated manuscript, came with the elongated manuscript to DC, although that didn't go anywhere. That one crashed and burned. Not long after, I submitted another one which was actually bought this time. This was in Detective Comics 444, which was Julie Schwartz's first issue after he came back to the magazine after Archie Goodwin's tenure. The Elongated Man was a character that I had always liked, and I picked him because I figured you couldn't sell a first script based on Batman or Superman because they had writers doing those characters. That you could probably sell a story about a minor character like the Elongated Man, and I did, and I sold a few more. 1 year after college, I was using my bachelor degree to scrub floors at the local Sears and Roebuck. Not literally, but it may as well have been. In 1977, I was hired by Paul Levitz, who was then some kind of chief editor and would later become, of course, publisher at DC, and took a staff job at DC, living in New York, at the princely sum of $100 a week. What a sucker. Paul would later become the Batman editor and give me my first shot at writing the character, bless his heart. But not long after I joined DC in 1977, I began to realize that the firm had been around for just over 40 years, and comics were still being produced in basically the same way. Although there have been many, many technological advances in the last few years, such as computer coloring, computer lettering. A lot of artists even produce, original art does not exist anymore as drawn on a page. They simply draw on the computer, which makes you wonder, is there anything such as original art anymore? I don't know. That's another one of those chicken and egg debates, I guess. Now, by 1977, DC's best days were well past. There were good days to come, but no one knew that. I realized later that almost no one up there actually wanted to be in comics. Most of the writers and artists were busy developing projects for other media. Len Wein and Marv Wolfman, two names you'll probably recognize, took me aside once in this very avuncular style and said, "Why are you so happy to be here? Don't you know that we're in the dying business?" And I said, "Well, I don't know that we are. I certainly hope we're not. I'm doing my best to see that we're not. I'm not sure we are now, but such prophecies have a way of becoming self-fulfilling. God knows it seems sometimes as though the publishers are doing their best to make that come true." In 1980, I sold my first Batman story, assigned to me, as I said, by Paul Levitz. That was Brave and Bold 169, featuring Batman and Katana. So it was my favorite character, teamed up with the creation of Gardner Fox, who's my favorite writer, and Murphy Anderson. So that wasn't too bad. I don't know if that was the first Batman story I ever had published, but I know it was the first one I actually wrote. And so that one has a very special place in my heart. Jim Aparo gave me a piece of the original art to it, which is still very valued to this day. I wrote a few short Batman stories for Paul. Some of these may have been published before Brave and Bold 169, as I said, but Brave and Bold 169 was the first. I was becoming established as a writer by that time, and scripted several issues of Brave and Bold, first for Dick Giordano, then for editor Len Wein. Because comics are usually published on a monthly basis, there's very little time usually to go back and refine a script. Usually, once you finish the script, in a couple days it's on the editor's desk and he's reading it. Much of my characterization of Batman, if there is a consistent characterization, was made up as I went along, and some of my early stories are inconsistent. But I was trying to combine the 1950s version of Batman with the 1970s version being written by Denny O'Neil and the excellent Frank Robbins, who does not receive enough credit for his contribution to the character. I can buy the fact that Batman is obsessed. He's driven by the tragedy he survived, but he's not insane. In fact, he may be the sanest man in the world, as he's living every day of his life doing exactly what he wants to do. What he wants and what he's wanted to do since he was 8 years old. Of course he has sadness in his life, but we all do. But Batman resolved to do something about it, and that decision, whether or not whatever action he takes helps him to avenge his parents, informs every action he takes. Few of our lives are determined by such clear-cut choices, and I often wish they were. The odd contradiction of Batman as a fictional character is that he was a fan-favorite character, but by the 1970s, his books weren't doing well. This became apparent one day when Detective Comics, the comic that gave DC Comics its name, was canceled. It was quickly saved by combining it with the better-selling Batman family, but the writing was on the wall. And soon Brave and Bold was canceled. This created a dilemma. One of DC's numerous foreign publishers was publishing Batman as a weekly title, consisting of Batman, Detective, World's Finest, and Brave and Bold. So another title had to be created to take the place of Brave and Bold, and it had to be a Batman title. Yeah, twist my arm. I came up with the idea of Batman and the Outsiders, which quickly became DC's third best-selling book. I didn't realize until much later that I had offended many at DC by creating for them a hit that they weren't able to. Well, it wouldn't be the last time I did that. Batman and the Outsiders didn't bring any hotshot artists from outside. It used Jim Aparo, who had been a staple of DC for several years. And Jim was, it was a delight to see Jim finally receiving his due on a popular book. Batman and the Outsiders was profitable enough to be selected for DC's hardcover softcover program, which is a really brief function that they had where you would publish a book in the what they call their Baxter format in, say, January of one year, and in January of next year, then the book would be reprinted in the newsstand format. This didn't last very long. Maybe it wasn't really a very good idea, but they just said, we want to do it, and I said, okay, fine, and I'm going to write both of them. And they said, okay, fine. So we put the Outsiders in their own team, we kicked Batman out of the book, which was difficult to do, but as George Costanza once said, I wanted to see if my boys could swim. Turned out they could. But Jim Aparo was having enough trouble drawing his share of Batman and the Outsiders. His health was just starting to decline, and he was slowing down. So we recruited from the ranks of the British artist, the incredible Alan Davis, giving him what I think, yeah, that's him right there, giving him what I think was his first assignment in American comics, a market all the Brits wanted to crack. Alan was, and remains, one of the most talented artists I've ever worked with. Our collaboration on Batman and the Outsiders, and later on Detective Comics, remains a high point in my career to this day. Alan is not only a valued colleague, but a valued friend. He once called me the most visual writer he's ever worked with, which is perhaps the highest compliment I've ever received. I added a character to Batman to replace Batman, not to replace him, but to basically add another character to the group. I added a character called Looker, who I say with pride is one of the most hated characters in the DC office. We can talk more about her later if you want to. This is another example of my bad career management. During this time, I should have been cultivating new assignments at Marvel, or writing an epic comic for Marvel, or doing creator-owned comics elsewhere. But I would have to give up editing The Outsiders, and I was having so much fun that I had no interest in doing so. Jim Aparo couldn't draw the entire book, so I used a lot of backup features of relative degrees of seriousness. And the creative freedom in not having to run every decision past another editor was very nearly addictive. One evening, for instance, I would get an idea, and this actually happened, get an idea to do a parody of Casey at the Bat, using the Outsiders as characters. And the next day I was writing the script. It was that easy. It was great. I was writing something like 3 books a month, cranking out 6 pages of script a day, 4 days a week. I'm one of the only writers I know who actually likes to write. On Friday I went to the office to do business and turn in scripts, and then maybe stay around and see a movie or have dinner with some of the other freelancers and staffers. 2 of the 3 books I was writing were The Outsiders and Batman and the Outsiders. The third was first Star Trek, which was the first commercial version of Star Trek I'm aware of. It was both commercial and acclaimed by the fans, by which I mean Trekkies, of which any of them I proudly claim for myself. I was paid well for this, but I was dismayed then to see DC, based on this success, schedule a Star Trek graphic novel written by Chris Claremont. Adding insult to injury, the art was by Adam Hughes, whose first start had been given to him on the Maze Agency a couple of years earlier. Well, what are you going to do? I left Star Trek then to write Detective Comics, onto which I had wrote Alan Davis. That promptly became DC's best-selling Batman title, until DC drove Alan off the title by altering the artwork on one of his covers without telling him. I think he found out when he saw the book on the stands, which is not something you do to Alan. I was eventually fired as editor of the Outsiders by Dick Giordano on a trumped-up charge of speaking against the company when I publicly spoke up for Bill Finger. DC owned the book, of course, and could have taken the book back in-house at any time, but DC decided to fire me instead of going through the contractual mechanism of simply paying me $500 to get me off the book. I stuck with the Outsiders to the bitter end, afraid what would happen to the characters in my absence, because the new editor could not have cared less about the title. I suggested several ways to save the book, until I realized that the editor, and maybe even DC, didn't want to save the book. So it died, though I promised it would return soon. That took 5 years, but it did return. Despite many frustrations, those years I was in New York from 1977 to 1987 were the happiest period of my life. I met Laurie Sutton, who became an editor at DC and remains a dear friend, and Frank Miller, who became, Frank Miller. In 1987, DC published Batman, Son of the Demon, a graphic novel that Jerry Bingham and I had been working on for a couple of years. It was the first of, really, let's face it, too many Batman graphic novels, but it became famous as the first appearance of the character that later became Damian Wayne. But DC refused to promote it. They did no advertising on it whatsoever, but still it sold through the roof. I was told the Batman office hated it and tried to have it killed. Though the profits on that book, I was told, put DC ahead of Marvel for the first time in like 15 years since the establishment of the direct market. Which is to say, mostly the establishment of comic shops. I was paid well and was hoping for at least a little appreciation from DC, but DC disavowed the book, claiming that Batman had fathered the child out of wedlock. Though I specifically saw to it that Batman and Talia, the daughter of Ra's al Ghul, were married in the course of the story, citing a past Batman story that I believe Dick Giordano himself had worked on. We can talk about that more if you like, but let's just say it's a highly frustrating chapter of my life. 20 years later, Warner Brothers would release Superman Returns, a major film in which it was revealed that Superman fathered a child out of wedlock. This time, no outrage from DC. Still, though I wrote the occasional short story and the occasional novel, most of them unsold, here and there, I never wanted to give up comics like many of my colleagues did, because not only do I like the characters of comics and the stories that they tell, but I like the actual method of comics. I like the language, the unique language developed in writing comics, which I got to be pretty good at. And I love finding those using those ways or using old ways of telling new stories. In 1993, this is like 5 years later or so, the third Outsiders title, Outsiders, was published for 2 years. This series is my least favorite of the three, as I was not the editor and was therefore not the decision maker on vital issues. So we tied into like every stupid crossover that DC did that year. And there were a lot of them.
Yeah.
I was told Jim, when I asked about the artist, if Jim and Barr was available, I was told Jim was too important for the series. So thanks a lot. But it was still the Outsiders and was often fun, despite a lot of editorial interference or being told that there were certain things I couldn't do. Most of the art on that series was by the excellent Paul Pelletier, who is still with DC and just getting better and better. After this series, DC gave up on me and tried to revive the title every few years using any writer but me. I've written the group in a few one-shots since, but not with any regularity. Except for the 2 Katana series, which we'll talk in a little while. I continued to write Batman, though no longer on a regular basis. I lured Alan Davis back to the character for a graphic novel called Full Circle, which remains probably my most favorite of all my Batman stories. One of my other favorites was also drawn by Alan, an 8-page Batman black and white story called Last Call at McSorley's. I wrote a number of Batman special projects, a couple of Elseworlds, including a hardcover called Dark Knight Dynasty, which I love to this day. The last chapter of that included a female descendant of Bruce Wayne and her sidekick, a genetically enhanced talking monkey who was her Robin. I think we called him Robert. He was a lot of fun to write. DC revived and canceled The Outsiders several times and gave it to what seemed like every writer but me. But, as Homer Simpson put it, yeah, but what are you going to do? In the meantime, Katana, the character, the female samurai from The Outsiders, bounced around the DC universe and was featured in the title Birds of Prey. I was urging DC to give Katana a solo title, and they finally obliged and gave it to another writer. All right. I should have seen the writing on the wall by this time, but I kept persevering. Most recently, I've written 2 Katana miniseries for DC that were published in Suicide Squad tie-in title. I was able to bring back Halo, Katana's sidekick, in the first, which was a great pleasure. The last issue of the second series is, I think, on sale now, which I suddenly realized may be the last comic book I ever write. If that's so, I think that's a shame, because, as I mentioned, I love comics and I've become really good at using the language of comics. But this week I was dismayed to find that a guy named James Huddle died. Jim was a comic book writer. He was a fellow founding father of the Malibu Ultraverse. And when your coworkers start dying, a man realizes he has more days behind him than he has before him. He also realizes he's left so much undone. I may never write Batman again, which I have to say I think is a shame, as I have many good ideas, none of which involve showing the readers Batman's penis.
Thank you.
I mean, who wants to see that? In looking back on these notes, I've realized I've whined, or in the splendid British phrase, whinged, a lot. It's easy to feel sorry for yourself if you're grading on a straight percentage, but if you're grading on the curve, I realize that I've had a wonderful career. I've been able to make a reasonable living and had a terrific amount of fun. I've also made more money from Batman than Bill Finger has. This isn't right, and something I've tried to do something about by bringing up Bill Finger as often as possible, especially in front of the people who were responsible for firing him back in the 70s. That's cost me, here and there. As I said, it was the alleged reason I got fired from editing The Outsiders. But I don't mind that. Imagine how Bill Finger felt when he was bringing in the Batman script for basic page rate and nothing more, and overheard a conversation between the second and third vice presidents in charge of stabling, talking about the sports cars they bought with the bonus checks from the Batman TV show. Bill Finger was never paid a royalty or a bonus check. He was never paid for any of the flood of Batman merchandising that overseas sweatshops vomited up in the 60s. He was never paid when his work was reprinted. All we can do as honor him is to try to keep his name alive. As Dr. McCoy said in Star Trek II, he's not really dead as long as we remember him. So if I've entertained you, thank you. If I failed to entertain you, I apologize. Please know that every word I've written in any of my stories was the best story I could write at the time. And every word was written, for better or for worse, not by assistants, wives, girlfriends, or ghosts, but by me. I love comics and believe they are worth their creators' best efforts, certainly as much as any television sitcom. Only now are creators to be able to be paid somewhere near their worth, which is a splendid thing after all these years. The situation is still not perfect, but the compensation has gotten better for the creators, the writers, the artists, than it has been. I do not think after my death, which I have every reason to believe is still far away, don't get me wrong, I will have a tombstone, because after my passing, science cannot be denied access to, this. Still, if I had a tombstone, I would want it inscribed with the verses from 2 Timothy 4, 7 through 8. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. Thank you.
Coming up, the Q&A session, including Making Batman Kill, how writing comics differs from writing novels, how he thinks Robin should be written, DC's usage of Damian Wayne, and more. First, thanks to all our patrons, more classic episodes of Deconstructing Comics have been unlocked, and I'm releasing them at the rate of one per week, in reverse order. This week, episode 100, in which I interview Phil Dunlap, creator of the syndicated comic strip Inkpen. The classic episodes of Deconstructing Comics can be found on our Facebook and Twitter feeds by clicking on November 2007 on the left sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com, or in publicly available posts on our Patreon page. Check out all our goals and help us reach them at patreon.com/deconcomics.
You like cheap comic books, right? Well, I'm Professor Allen, and I talk about cheap comic books on the Quarterbin podcast. In every episode, I'll dissect a single comic from my collection, as long as I paid no more than 25 cents for the issue. Forget about $4 new comics that you can read in 4 minutes, or crossover events that can cost $100 to collect. Join me in the Quarterbin, where even bad comics are a bargain, and good ones are a steal. The Quarterbin podcast is part of the Relatively Geeky Podcast Network. Visit us at relativelygeekypodcast.blogspot.com or search Relatively Geeky or Quarterbin Podcast in iTunes. I guarantee it'll be worth every penny.
Some questions. I know we have questions here, so I'll let you answer them as you...
Let me... Okay, you're right there.
What do you think about the illusion of realism that Batman killing brings to all media, comics, movies, whatever?
I don't know if I can answer that question per se. I do know that I don't maintain this is a difficult wire to walk because I don't think Batman is a born killer. I mean, he's not bloodthirsty. He's not vengeful. But on the other hand, when we have, let's face it, the reason Batman doesn't kill primarily is because his villains are too good to kill. There's that famous story in Batman #1, the first Joker story, that when Bill Finger wrote, he brought in the script and Batman killed him. And the editor, I guess it was Whitney Ellsworth, a long-time DC, said, "Are you kidding? This guy's too good to kill. Bring him back." And they brought him back later in that same first issue. But I also believe that Batman is too pragmatic to realize that, not to realize that if he lets a killer escape or go without punishment, then he may be in some sense responsible for the next victim of that character, of that killer. So I've had him kill a few times, but again, as I say, never liking it, never bloodthirsty, but he has disposed of a few guys here and there. I don't know if that answers your question. Oh, sure. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. That was wonderful. The question I have is, what would you say to an 11-year-old who reads comic books, loves comic books, but wants to grow up and make comic books one day, but in the classroom, not a great artist, or not a great writer? Mm-hmm. What kind of encouragement might you give, or discouragement might you give to that person?
I'm not sure, because nowadays it's a lot harder to break into comics than it was when I did. Apparently, DC's comics carry disclaimers in the indicia that they do not look at unsolicited scripts or artwork. I understand, if I understand the situation correctly, that the only way you can get any work looked at is to approach their special staffers at a comic book convention and take a look at it there, which is actually a pretty bad place to have work looked at and evaluated for the first time, because the convention is just so frantic on its own. So I frankly don't know what to do there. What a lot of guys do is they start off in some of the smaller independent publishers and do good work there, and sometimes I understand DC has contacted them about doing work for DC. Mm-hmm. That's, I guess, the best thing the best advice I can give on that, although I don't know. In all seriousness, do 11-year-olds want to get into comics nowadays? I don't know. Most of the fans that I see at conventions are basically guys my age or a little younger who grew up reading the books when they were kids, and but not kids. I don't hear kids wanting to grow up reading Batman anymore, which is a shame. But you have to wonder what DC thinks about all this whole situation. I mean, if you look at either this series on DC Direct, the Titan series, or the Doom Patrol series, I mean, these things are just full of obscenities and violence. Yeah. I'm not trying to play the prude here, because I dipped into that well sometimes myself. But I mean, this is Batman we're talking about, and when Dick Grayson says "fuck Batman," I mean, this is Batman. How can you let a kid see that? Yeah. Because you want Batman is assumed to be a children's character. This pisses off DC very much, because they know Batman is a mature hero for mature people. And while I can believe that he has to be treated seriously, these are kids' comics, let's face it. A guy whose name you would recognize once said that a logo to what was the Fantastic Four? The logo to Marvel's The Fantastic Four, the very first version, he almost passed up because he thought it was a kids' comic. And I said, well, The Fantastic Four is a kids' comic. It was then and it is now. The storytelling has grown more sophisticated, and kids have grown more sophisticated too, let's face it. But I still think there are some things that you just don't do with Batman or some of the famous DC characters, like having Superman be a father or child out of wedlock. I actually rather liked Superman Returns, or most of it, but that left me scratching my head. Yeah, you in front here.
I use Camelot 3000 in one of my graphic novels classes. Mm-hmm. So I'm never going to get a chance to, number one, great, but I'm never going to get a chance to ask you again to ask the question that I get asked every time that I can't answer. Lancelot says, "Take me instead of her," and he drops dead. Guinevere wakes up and she's alive, but Lancelot is still alive. In theory,
I'm going to have to take your word for that because I don't remember after all this time. I used to make tremendous fun of Denny O'Neil because he did not remember every panel and every word of dialogue of every comic he'd ever written. And now, years later, I find people approaching me with old stories, asking me questions about stories, and I have to say, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know. I'm not dismissing your question because it sounds like I'll have to go back and look that up, but I just don't remember. I'm sorry.
Because the kids are always like, wait a minute. If he offers his soul for her, shouldn't he be dead? And he's not. Yeah. And I'm always like, you know what? I have no clue.
Well, that bit was taken, or shall we say, stolen,
from
directly
Mallory.
from the movie Camelot.
Yeah.
Where Lancelot, who at this point has been thought of as extremely stuck-up snob, brings a knight who's killed during an accident during jousting back to life, and he survived there too. So I guess that's why.
Okay, that's fair.
And I guess it's not. He was not offering a trade, his soul for Guinevere's soul. He was basically just praying to God that God would bring Guinevere back to life, and he did.
I just want, because that's the answer I'm going to use when the next year when they ask me. That's what I'm going to use.
If they don't like it, then tell them to.
Mike said.
Say, no, I actually spoke to Mike.
Yes, and
So, thank you for your stories. They were really great. So, it seems that every time I read an interview with a creator, everyone has these horror stories about working for DC. Do they treat anyone well? And that is a serious question.
Well, they have over the years, yes. They thought very highly of Jim Aparo. As I said, Jim had been one of their stalwarts for years, and they thought the world of Jim and treated him very well. They treat a lot of their creators well. It just depends on, I guess, to some extent, how well, like anything, you feel you've been treated by DC. And I've never been shy, for better or for worse, about mentioning my various successes at DC, or saying that, for instance, Batman and the Outsiders was a big hit that DC was not able to come up with in-house. They had to go to an outside guy, basically meaning me, who was not a staffer, to come up with it. So I don't want to give the image that DC does not treat anyone well, because I believe they do, but like any organism, any living or otherwise, they treat people well who feel they've been treated well by that person. This is not necessarily consistent, because you can still find nowadays, up at DC and elsewhere, just among the ranks of fandom, maybe within this room, people who think that Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were treated very well by DC, even though DC fired them when they tried to sue DC. And DC's response to this was, well, they tried to sue DC. That's why they got treated like they did. Maybe that's the case, but on the other hand, Superman is the reason DC Comics exists. So you think there would be room for some leeway in here, but again, it's like it's what they call the golden rule. Whoever has the gold makes the rules. There's the Outsiders, the Young Justice Outsiders series that's on or was on and is going to be on again, I guess, in a few weeks on DC Direct. I was not told anything about that series. I know I'm going to get paid for it. DC's very good about keeping their contracts because they don't obviously want to be labeled as a publisher that doesn't pay. And that's fine. So they've always kept a letter of their contract to me, usually. But no one told me anything about Young Justice Outsiders or asked me anything about their treatment of the characters. And I would have liked to have known, and I think there may have been suggestions I could make treating Halo or Geoforce. Katana's not had any dialogue yet, so I don't know what they're going to do with her. But the treatment of the characters. I like the idea of Halo being a kind of a spoiler alert, I guess, a living mother box, because that just basically ties her into Jack Kirby's New Gods. Yeah. And though I stand behind no man in my respect for Jack Kirby, New Gods was never my favorite of his material. Yes?
You mentioned a couple times using the language of comics.
Mm-hmm.
Two things. What do you mean by that? And because you've also written novels and other things, how is that different from the language of novels, for example?
Well, it's different in the sense that You have to tell the story in the script visually, so the artist can state it visually, can tell it visually. And even there, it varied widely among the first generation of comic book writers. Gardner Fox was not really a visual writer. He would, although he was a wonderful storyteller, he would write a panel where Batman would swing into a room, and there would be a caption, "Batman swings into the room," which, okay, well, you're seeing that. But Bill Finger, for instance, was, maybe because he watched a lot of movies, a very visual storyteller, maybe the best visual storyteller of his era. His stuff is told in visuals very well, and there's very few redundant captions, and most of them who were put there I would be willing to bet put there by the editor, or because Finger thought he would be second guessed by the editor otherwise. By the language of comics, I mean, when I grew up with comics, they've changed this, I think, to their dismay. If you saw a word balloon that had a dotted line around it instead of a solid line, what does that tell you?
A whisper.
I'm sorry?
You're thinking.
No, he whispers.
Dotted
Solid
line
balloon
is
is something else
whisper.
again. That means, but for decades that meant whisper. Now, in reading so many of the earlier Batman stories and other early shows when DC started bringing out their 80-page annuals, which had stories that were much older in them, there were often cases of when a character was whispering, he would have a normal thought balloon, but there would be the word whisper in parentheses in the beginning of the balloon. And I found that fascinating as a kid, and wondered, when the idea of having a dotted line balloon indicate whispering, came into custom. And when did the readers realize that that's what that meant? There's all kinds of there are many kinds of devices like that were developed for comics, by which I mean the storytelling of comics.
At this point, comics writer Dan Mishkin speaks up.
Mike, can I give an example?
Oh, sure, Dan.
One time I wrote a Batman story for Dick Giordano, and I had in the script Batman stopping a punch with his fist, and Dick's response was, if you were writing prose, you could do all sorts of things, and stopping with the fist would be fine. But this is a comic book, and it is much better to have Batman gracefully step aside and have the action complete, but miss Batman, and the guy sort of stumbles and falls. Because you maintain action, and it's just visually more interesting. It's a good example.
Yeah, as to answer your other question, which I almost forgot about, about the difference between prose and comics. Well, obviously when you're writing the prose, that's the reader's entire window into the story. So that has to delineate pretty clearly what's going on physically and why. It also has its advantages because you don't have to describe maybe everything in an entire room. You need to describe only the important props in that room for the scene. So it goes back and forth. There are advantages and disadvantages to both of them. Some writers can do both well, some writers can do only one of them well, and some writers can't do either of them well.
Thank you.
Way in the back there. Yes, you.
Leo? So you were writing Detective Comics in the mid-'80s?
Yes.
And
Late
you
80s.
were Batman and Robin. That was the same time Jim Starlin was on the Batman book?
Yes.
And that's where Jason Todd was kind of becoming the rough and tumble Jason Todd. You wrote Robin much more traditionally. Jason was written kind of like Burt Ward simultaneously as he was kind of the bad Robin in the Batman title. Do you know why you chose to do that, or if there's any editorial suggestions on that?
Well, yeah, I chose to do it basically because that's the way I wanted to write Robin, and nobody told me not to. I kept, and I still don't know to this day, and if anybody knows, I'm not really asking, but I don't know to this day why Batman would allow Jason Todd or Tim Drake or any of the other Robins, why he would bring them into his life and let them know his secret identity and all his secrets when they have other parents, when their parents are still, I guess, mostly alive, although Jason Todd's father was killed by Two-Face, I understand, or was retroactively killed by Two-Face or something. I don't understand the reason why. Well, I mean, I understand why a character like Nightwing exists, because they want to, divide that bat loaf into as many profitable slices as they can. But I've never liked the idea of Dick Grayson growing up and becoming a solo crime fighter on his own. Years ago, I've told this story elsewhere, so forgive me if you've heard it, but in the 80s, when Len Wein was editing Batman, they wanted to, I guess Nightwing was an active character, but they wanted to bring Robin into the book somehow, and nobody knew what to do. And I said, okay, look, how about this? In the issues, in the May issue of Batman, Dick Grayson comes back to Wayne Manor, and he fights crime with Batman for that summer as Robin, as teenage Robin. Okay, in the issue on sale in September, when school comes back in, Bruce Wayne walks into Jason's hot bedroom, he yanks back the covers and says, "Hey, this is going to be real exciting, chum. You're in the 6th grade." And Dick Grayson wakes up and he's 12 years old, and you never explain it, and you never talk about it, and you never mention it again. And of course, there were certain writers who basically just when they heard about this started throwing their feces around like capuchin monkeys. So obviously that didn't go anywhere. So basically I wrote Robin that way just because that's how I think Robin should be written. I'm not familiar with the character who basically I think stole the wheels off the Batmobile at one point. And to me, I kind of roll my eyes at that because wouldn't there be a way of making it so that couldn't happen? Wouldn't Batman have a way of the Batmobile not being disabled if thugs came across it in the street? But does that answer your question? I'm sorry, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it sounds like you just wrote him how you cared to him.
I wrote him, to my knowledge, like the classic like Dick Grayson had been written back in, say, the 50s and 60s. He's always charging into a fight, and sometimes he's careless and almost gets hurt, and Batman can use that as a disciplinary measure. And he's always making these really terrible jokes. Way in the back.
Have to preface my question by saying it's really awesome that you're here.
Thank you.
Some of your stories are some of my favorites. Binge reading Batman and the Outsiders again recently was really awesome. And if you're worried about legacy and stuff like that, kids today are watching, the Young Justice Outsiders, and they know Halo, they know Geoforce, so the work is going to live on. So.
Oh well, thank you. My main concern with the Young Justice series, as I guess I kind of said, was having people think that Halo was a Jack Kirby character from square one when she's not. As much as I love Jack Kirby's work, he didn't have anything to do with Halo. And the Katana, I think, is maybe what I call my legacy character, if there's any such thing, because she's all over the place right now and seems to be pretty popular. I think probably the makers of the DC Superhero Girls cartoons were probably, when they were first organizing that franchise, were looking through them, were looking through all the characters and saying, gee, aren't there any characters here who aren't white? And they found Katana, and they said, oh, thank God, here's an Asian character, and here's Bumblebee, oh, thank God, there's a black character. And although there are a lot more now than there were some years ago, they're maybe still not as frequent as they ought to be. So I'm glad to have Katana represented. Katana was not created as a role model for young Asian girls, but I'm glad that she's out there for that purpose.
So what I was wondering was, when you took over on Detective, the previous run of comics had with Doug Mensch, Catwoman was fighting side by side with Batman. Her knowledge of his secret identity was kind of ambiguous. In some books she knew, in some books she didn't. It was really weird. DC said in the edit letters pages, she doesn't know, but she knows. Then when you went on, you did a story where Joker puts her in a machine.
Yeah, the very first story Alan Davis and I did.
Yeah, and she forgets his identity. Was that an editorial thing because we're doing the Crisis on Infinite Earths transition to tie into year one where she was more villainous, or was that an idea of your own?
No, that was basically my marching orders from editor Danny O'Neill when I took over the writing of Detective was basically said the first thing I want you to do is get rid of the fact that Catwoman knows Batman's secret identity, because he didn't like that. So I called a couple of people, including a couple of artists who worked on the books that came before, and said, does Catwoman know Batman's secret identity? And they weren't able to tell me yes or no. They said, well, we think so, but we're not sure. So I said, okay, we can probably get a good story out of assuming that she does know that, and then having the Joker capture her and hold her hostage and torture her to remove that from her mind, and I think we did. So that was why that happened. Sometimes the editor will say, I would like this to happen, and you can get a really good story out of it. And that was that case.
Thank you.
Sure.
A couple questions over there, actually, on that
Other-
side of the room.
Anyone I haven't seen besides you up front here who's had one?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
I've got a question about, you were speaking about characters and sort of being read as progressive. Your work on Camelot 3000 has, the gender-bending storyline, and your work on the Maze Agency also dealt with the HIV/AIDS crisis and an issue, mentioned in passing. And
yeah, we did one story about that.
Safe sex is mentioned in there. And I was wondering what your rationale behind including some of those topics were specifically.
My rationale was just that we get a good story out of it. The idea of a really macho Arthurian knight being reincarnated as a woman was just really too good to pass up. And I did a book for Malibu called Mantra, which is basically a warrior who was reincarnated as a woman, much to his dismay. And we had a lot of fun with that until the company pulled the plug on it, basically saying they were told that the retailers didn't like it. And I said, well, let's get the retailers on the phone and find out about this. Let's ask them about it. Let's let's pass the ball back and forth and see if we can come up with some kind of mutual ground. And they just said, no, we're not going to do that. Get rid of the character. So they did. They canceled the original series and brought back Mantra as a cute teenage girl. And I wrote that too, I have to admit, because I was afraid that was they were going to use that as a rationale to take me and Terry Dodson off as the creators of the character. So if there was any licensing done, they would have to. They could keep that in the office. But that didn't last long either. There were a couple. I think that new series went like 7 or 8 issues, of which I wrote 6, and then I was fired. And some Malibu, they took my name off one of the scripts that I wrote, and a Malibu vice president wrote the last 2 issues. So when you have a work for hire character, and a company vice president wants to write your character, well, there's nothing you can do. You're just dead in the water because you have no argument against that. So we got 2 more.
Okay, two really quick. Would you ever consider adding Elongated Man to the Outsiders?
Yeah, it was the first, when we first organized Batman and the Outsiders, we decided that we wanted like 3 new characters and Batman and 2 established DC characters to come in. Because that would make that would make their pathway into the DC universe a little more easy. And so that was a lot of, we consider Green Arrow, we consider the Elongated Man, because I love the Elongated Man. But I eventually figured, I discussed this with Len Wein, who was the original editor, and we decided, I guess, that we could get more, Metamorpho is maybe a better team character because he's really powerful and has cool visual powers. And Black Lightning his book had been canceled not too long before that, and he was just kind of floating around the DC universe in a lot of really bad stories that Tony Isabella had nothing to do with, by the way. Did not write, so I said, okay, well, let's take Black Lightning back because he's got a lot of potential, and DC wanted him kept alive as a possible merchandising character anyway. So let's bring him back to life and deal with his story. Not bring him back to life, but bring him back to an active series and use him there. And we decided to do that, and that worked out pretty well, I think. I think, while taking nothing away from the character, from the creation of Tony Isabella and Trevor Von Eden, I think that part of Black Lightning's popularity owes to the fact that he was kept alive in the pages of the Outsiders for so long. I think that's how a lot of people got to know him.
What were the circumstances of you leaving Detective?
Oh, Detective. Oh, yeah. Well, I was willing to sign. I had written 12 issues. I signed up for 12 issues. I'd written 13. Then I was willing to come back, but that was when Alan Davis had quit the book because they had altered his artwork without telling him. I was pretty steamed about that because, I said, look, is the editor allowed because of one stupid decision to basically get this best-selling book canceled? Mm-hmm. I'm not canceled, but Detective went to other teams who, as much as I respect them, the book did not do as well as it did under Barr and Davis. Mm-hmm. And DC sort of said, yeah, the editor makes the decision. If that's his decision, that's what he's allowed to do. And so I was considering coming back. I would have come back if I was offered, but I was considered, basically just, too unreliable to work with or something. I was considered, trouble to work with, which is something I've been told a lot through my career. Okay, last question right there.
What are your thoughts on Grant Morrison sort of poaching Son of the Demon to create the character of Damian Wayne?
I'm pretty pissed off by that. Because I was told this is going to require a little bit of backstory. After Son of the Demon was published, As I said, it was published with no advertising by DC whatsoever. The thing sold phenomenally. And like the week after that, the DC offices, they were saying, we can't ever use this character again. Jeanette Kahn, who was the publisher of DC at that time, told me that she was told by DC, by Warner Brothers higher-ups, that if that character ever appeared again, she would be fired. Now, I don't know if I believe that, then or now. Actually, I take it back, now I don't believe it. Then I kind of didn't believe it. And so I was told the character would never be used again. That was a pretty bitter pill to swallow because I had the sequel all planned out. But I was willing to accept, okay, I can never use the character again, that's okay, as long as nobody ever uses the character again. And then Grant Morrison came in and said, I want to use this character, and DC said, of course. Hey, what the hell? Sure you can do it. So I don't think I know Grant Morrison had no intent to do any disrespect to me. But on the other hand, you'd think that's a consideration that one creator should take before he uses the work of another. I mean, if you've gone to the trouble of creating a Son of Batman in this $15 hardcover graphic novel, do you think the writer wouldn't have any more plans for that character? Isn't that pretty much a given that he would? And I did. So,
thank you very much.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on Mike Barr's keynote address or on the direction of the podcast generally. What would you like to hear on the show? Email us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com. Tweet us at deconcomics. Like our Facebook page or join our active Facebook group. Support the show by pledging to us on Patreon. Our tiers start at just $2 a month. Pledge at least $4 a month to get our Patreon-only series Spider-Man 1963 and Tim Catches Up with the MCU. Go to patreon.com/deconcomics to join the fun. Also, please help us get noticed by reviewing us on Apple or any other podcast source. Do your shopping at deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon so that we get a percentage of the sale. And share our episodes on your social media. We appreciate your support in bringing Deconstructing Comics, Critiquing Comics, and To the Batpoles to a larger audience. Our theme is from bensound.com. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us, and Mulele and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. Mulele and I will be here next week to talk about a children's book / comic about a dog and his boy, and the latest from one of our favorites, Chad in Amsterdam. And in 2 weeks, here on Deconstructing Comics, Emmett and I will talk about the hardcover collection Shazam, a celebration of 75 years. Till next week, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.